Welcome to What's in a Name, data stories that would make the bard proud. My name is James McGillivray, and today we're going to be talking about data storytelling here at SQL Bits 2020. Why do we tell stories? Well, storytelling as a form of communication is one of the oldest things that we can trace in human existence, from cave paintings that we can find in places like South Africa and around the world, to hieroglyphics as a language that was developed that told the progression of time. Stories have been used to communicate for as long as human history can be traced. So why do we use data storytelling in data? Well, storytelling brings together the three main parts of communicating with data. We have the data itself, we have visuals and visual representations of the data, and we have a narrative. Now, obviously, the narrative is the part that we add to get to a data story rather than a report or a presentation. But how do we use these things together, and why do we use all three and not just one or the other? Well, you see, with data and visuals, you can enlighten your audience. The visuals reinforce the data, they show trends and make it easier for the audience to determine what exactly they're looking at and where to focus their attention. Data with a story is excellent because we use to explain is a good way of communicating. We can use that to explain something to our audience. We can use it to reinforce the facts that we have by supplying actual numbers. But it lacks a little bit in that it's not as easy to comprehend. Visuals and a narrative, well, that's kind of like a slideshow, kind of like a presentation that we would look at, and they can create a very engaging. Without data, it doesn't have much meaning or substance. So those two, whilst pretty, don't actually have substance. So the sweet spot where we can really enforce a difference, where we can really make people focus on what we're saying and focus on how they can move forward to improve, is to actually have the combination of all three: data, visuals, and a narrative. And by doing that, you can really drive home your message, get people to engage emotionally with your data, with the story you're trying to tell, and you're far more likely to have a successful uptake from that presentation, from that piece of data that you are conveying and communicating. So what are we going to do in this session? Well, firstly, I'm going to show you some data, a fairly plain and mundane data set that we got from the US government, published every year. And we're going to say, well, this is our data set. This is how we can understand the data and get an idea of what it says. But how do we tell stories? Then we're going to move on and actually explore some stories. Now, I've built a couple of stories on this various data sets that we've got. I've added some additional open source data. I've put in some references to things that happened and we will see how we can use that to enhance our story and create an emotional investment or engagement with our data. And then what we'll do is we'll actually go through and highlight the choices we've made in creating this story and how the decisions we've actually made when creating these data stories as to how to communicate them most effectively to our audience. So let's start with a little bit of background about stories. So firstly, I'm going to give a shout out here to a terrific author, Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. She wrote a book called Storytelling with Data, and it is really really an excellent resource for learning about visualization, about best practices, and about how to put all of these things together. It's far more comprehensive than a session we can do in an hour. And I would highly recommend that if you are interested in this and you can get your hands on a copy, to read this book and to see all of the things that she recommends and all of the lessons she teaches in this story. But basically, I've taken some of the key points from this book and tried to summarize them in one slide. And it's basically how we go about building a story that can effectively communicate. So the first thing that is a non-negotiable is that we, as the person producing this story, need to understand the context of the data. You need to have a deep understanding of the data. You need to understand the background. You need to understand the events that happened around the time or the events that you're representing. And you need to ensure that you have a very clear understanding of what you're doing it, because there's no quicker way to lose your audience than to make false assumptions or to create a situation where you break trust before you try to even communicate your insights. So it's critically important to have a clear understanding of the context of your data and to know what it is that you're going to be presenting, talking about, designing, whatever it is when you're doing your story. And the second thing is more on the design side. It's more on the aesthetic side, is about choosing the right visuals. And in this specific step, I try to basically go with the concept of simpler is better. The simpler your visuals, the more self-explanatory they are, the more likely you are to have a situation where your audience is familiar with the visual. They don't need to explain or understand how the visual works. And that is a key part in not drawing attention or not forcing the audience to use too much brain power to do on extraneous things, but to focus all of their attention on the actual data that you're trying to commit. So lots of bar charts, lots of line graphs, lots of scatter plots, and that kind of visuals. No pie charts, but that's a totally different story, but no pie charts. The next step is basically clean up your visuals and your data. And that basically is to talk about what we call cognitive load. The cognitive load is how much your brain can process and how quickly it can process the things that it's seeing. The more distractions that you have, the more data points that you have, the less likely you are for people to automatically pick out the things that you want them to see. So what we try to do here is we try to get rid of any excess information. We try to get rid of outliers and things that may not really have any relevance to the point that we're trying to tell, without compromising the quality and the integrity of the data. But for instance, if you have one if we were talking about some sales data maybe, and you had one sale that had a 2,000% profit, and it basically threw the scale of your graph off entirely, but it's such a minimal contribution to overall, it would not be unethical or misleading to actually take that data point out so that you got a more clear view of what is actually happening in the significant data. So that kind of thing, we get rid of data that really messes up our views. We get rid of visual aspects that are not necessary, crazy color palettes that aren't needed. We get rid of all the graph backgrounds and overbearing line and every data point having a number. You know, there are loads of ways we can make our visuals cleaner, and we'll have a look at some of them in the examples as we move forward through this session. The next thing that we're talking about here is pre-attentive attributes. Now, all of these things could have sessions all on their own, but we have a short session, so we don't have a lot of time to talk about them. But pre-attentive attributes is basically drawing your viewer's eye to specific things through the use of highlighting. And highlighting can be done in a number of ways. It can be done through bold fonts. It can be done through sizes, by having one element bigger than the others. It can be done by using color, having a single element in color and everything else in a gray or a neutral color that will stick out. It can be done by having by breaking a pattern. There are loads of ways that you can actually leverage these pre-attentive attributes, but some of the simpler ones we'll have a look at and we'll talk about. But if you want to learn a bit more about that, there's recommended reading is what they call the Gestalt principles. Those are essentially the way of how things are connected, and the way we then use pre-attentive attributes is actually by breaking all of those. So that's something you can go and look for the Gestalt principles. And then our last sort of step in terms of building the story is actually to tell the story. Now, telling the story is a step all on its own, because we have to work out what to include, what to exclude, what order to present our various findings in. We have to work out a strong introduction or a conclusion. We have to give the audience takeaway points that they can use. So telling the story is an art form all on its own. But before we get too deep into theory, maybe we should move on a bit, talk about stories themselves, and then look at some actual examples. Okay, so let's go on to Power BI now and have a look at an example of an exploratory data story and how we can leverage some of these things we've been talking about and make some good design decisions. Right, here we go. So let me give you a bit of context about this data set first. So this data set comes from the US government, their Census Bureau, and essentially it records the number of babies born every year and what names were given to these babies. So it's the number of babies born in a year, the names given to these babies, and it also records two additional points of information. It records the sex of the baby, and it records the state in which the baby was born. Okay, so here we have a little bit of we have a fairly plain, boring data set. In terms of, it's literally just a list of, in 1910, there were X many babies who were male and were called Brian. In 1911, there were X plus 6 babies called Brian, in that state. So it's a fairly boring data set, but there's a lot we can do with it, because it's a very big data set. We've got almost 100 years worth of data, and we have about 311 million babies born in that period. So there are bound to be some interesting things that we can find. So the first thing is, this is a report that I've designed that we can use to explore the data ourselves. So there's no story here. This is basically, I've designed a couple of things, a couple of graphs that I think are interesting that a user may use. I've given them a couple of filters here up at the top, obviously, for them to interact with, and I've given a couple of graphs that they can look at. So first thing to notice, you will see that we are using basically the Wimbledon colors, green and purple. I used to, when I first developed this chart, this data set, these reports, I was using pink and blue, because the design decision behind that was basically people already associate pink and blue with the different sexes, and it would be intuitive, and it would minimize the cognitive load, so people would automatically know what they're talking about. But I've learned some things about some of the implications of the colors and some of the sort of history of the colors, and it's maybe not the best design choice in terms of moving forward. So I went and looked up, and there are a couple of examples of or a couple of suggestions for different color palettes you can use when representing sex. And this is the one that I really liked. They're both, it's a very nice color palette. And so we chose that, and I figured it was pretty simple for people to work out. We've got a chart on the right here that says most popular male names, where everything's green. We've got a chart here that says most popular female names, where everything's purple. And my assumption is that people would be able to reference that females are represented by purple data points and males by green. So that's the first thing, is talking about the colors. The second thing here is that we have basically 6 charts. This is about the limit of the number of charts I would try to put on a visualization. Any more than that, and I find it gets a bit messy, a little bit difficult to follow, and a little bit overwhelming. So we've decided to keep six charts here, and a couple of little visuals along the top that just have single measures on them. Again, there's 4 there, and that's also a decent-ish number, but I wouldn't want to go too much more than that. You start getting a little bit overwhelming. So here's our report. Not really going to play around with it too much for now. The report is available on my website if anyone else would like to explore it. If you'd like to play with this data, see if you can come up with your own data stories, I'll share a link towards the end of the session where you can go and find it. So this is our data set, and we've basically laid the platform here. So we're going to pop back now, just have a look at a couple of decisions that were made here. Before we do that, I just want to show you one other thing. In my opinion, and this is not definite, I would have to present this to my user group and do some research and check that everybody is on the same page as me. But I thought most of the things in this graph on this report are self-explanatory: number of babies, number of unique names, most popular name, etc. Except for this one here, which I thought was maybe a little bit confusing. So one thing I've done here, just to ensure that my users can not get lost or have a little bit additional info, is I've added in a tooltip over here, where you can hover over it and it'll give you a description of exactly what that measure means. This number shows what percentage of all babies had one of the top 10 most popular names. So just a little bit of context here in case somebody feels that they need it. Because I also use it again down here, and I guess I could put that same tooltip on there because it's the same measure. It's just tracking it over time. Let's quickly go down, document some of those design decisions and make them explicit and prove that we actually thought about them before we made them, and etc. So the first one is to choose appropriate visuals. Now that report we've just looked at had 2 bar charts, 1 line chart. It's really, these are common, well-known visuals that your user base will be familiar with regardless of their experience with data visualization. And that's a good starting point for an exploratory data set. No advanced knowledge required. Okay. Secondly, we've chosen colors. Now, I've kind of spoken through the rationale of my color choices already, but just a couple of points. Always use the same color to represent the same category. No blue, and blue means yes on this page and blue means no on that page type of thing. That's a surefire way to confuse your audience and to break their trust. People will automatically become suspicious of things like that and think that you're trying to mislead them. So that's definitely something to keep in account. Secondly, use palettes. So when I say use palettes, go online. There are tons of places you can find color palettes, predefined palettes, sets. Use company palettes because they've probably been designed with a goal in mind. All of those kinds of things. And there are lots of resources about choosing color palettes and choosing colors that work well together. And then the third thing, just to remember to consider people with visual impairments and how your color choices may affect them. So again, just think about your colors, use them explicitly. Okay. The third one, fairly simple. We've provided filters for all of the most commonly accessed data points. We've given our users a chance to interact with the data in the way that suits them best. So that is definitely a best practice, something we should strive to do. And then finally, we talked about this, and I showed the example of using a visual header tooltip in a situation where something was a little bit complicated, a little bit difficult to understand. It's a fairly small thing. It takes 5 minutes to set up. It really gives your users a lot more confidence, comfort, etc. So those are all conscious decisions we've made to improve our users' experience when they are using our reports. But as I said before, this isn't really a data story so much as a choose your own adventure type of thing where a user can go in any way they want. So let's go into a physical story, an actual story where I've taken the data, found something, and used that to build a narrative and go onto that. And we'll talk about how that works. So back to Power BI. And we can choose to go to our data stories. So here we start with our first data story, and this story is about population growth. So actually what happened here was I saw on that exploratory report of ours, I'm just going to go back there for a second, I looked at this top left-hand visual, and I noticed that these total number of births seems to be not going up, which was a little bit surprising to me. So that was basically the first thing that piqued my interest, and that's where I started this story from. So let's go on there and start again, on that picture. And the first thing is you'll see that I basically just brought that graph across because this was the starting point of my story. Okay. However, because in the context of what we're going to look at now, I'm not really concerned about males versus females in this specific scenario. I'm concerned about the total number of births. So the first thing that I wanted to do here was to remove any mental load on people that may think, hey, I need to look at something, there's date, there's color, it's trying to draw my attention. No, I don't want that. So what I want to do is I want to just make that a single color. And then I've done a couple of little things here with it. So the first thing I've done is I've actually put it into two colors. I said a single color. It's actually two colors, but the color is totally different. Now you can see that I haven't used the same colors because I don't want anyone to get confused. I've used a totally different palette. And then I've used that same color in my little text blurb on the right-hand side, which we're going to talk about in a second. So I've done a couple of things here. The other thing I've done is I've got another piece of information because, as I said, what I was thinking about was that this data was a little surprising to me because of this data. And this data is the population by year, which shows a fairly steady growth in population, which kind of doesn't tie into this graphic over here that says the number of births is declining. So that was absolutely where I wanted to compare these two pieces of data. And then I wanted to explore and find out why this happened. Okay, so the first thing is that this is an ideal opportunity to just touch on ethics and to touch on completeness of data. Because at this point, if I were trying to if I were trying to mislead people, if I were trying to create fake news, as they call it, I could easily use these two graphics to create some sort of emotional response in people by talking about how the number of people born in America is going down, but the number of people living in America is going up, and therefore there must be this scourge of immigration. And I'm not, I don't want to do that at all, but I'm trying to illustrate a point how by using an incomplete data set and preying on the fact that people are very easily manipulated, I could very easily create something like that to reinforce some point that I'm trying to make, to stir up some sort of emotion. And this is why it's so critical that people think about all the things we consume and to understand how we can be manipulated by people, because that's not even untrue. There's nothing untrue in either of these two graphs. There's nothing fake about them. They're both from verifiable sources. The sources will appear in a second, but the conclusion is the falsehood here, because there are multiple factors that contribute to the number of people who are alive at a given time. And the one that actually I've actually managed to get data for has nothing to do with immigration at all. It actually shows that people are living significantly longer as time goes by, and that is a story which is quantifiable, and it's there by fact. However, I don't have. We already know that immigration and immigration could be a contributing factor to this changing population, but I don't have any data on that. So what I've tried to do here is I've actually tried to explicitly state that as part of my conclusion, because I really don't want to mislead people, and that should always be our goal, is to not mislead people with our stories. So the first thing we talked about, remove clutter. That's when I got rid of that extra color that I didn't need. In this case, the relevance of male versus female was absolutely irrelevant. It didn't have anything to do with our story, so we removed it. We established a pattern by using consistent fonts, colors, and sizes. So you saw that I used, in all three graphs, I used the same type of graph. I had the same axes. They all started at 1910 and ended in 2019. They all highlighted from 1980 to 2019 in orange. They all had the same gray for all the other colors. You know what the consistency means that you can, I'm building up a thing where you don't have to now spend energy or mental capacity working out what the graph means. You kind of already know it. You look at the first time, you work it out, and then going forward, you know what this thing means. And this is also something ethically we have to be careful of, is that people can manipulate us by preying on the fact that we expect repetition. And if you don't use it like that, you can actually create stories that are misleading. The third thing is to show the full picture. So I've talked about this. Don't leave out data that doesn't suit your narrative. And if you know that you are missing some data that would provide extra context, if you have what we call known unknowns, you must highlight those so that your user is aware, and again, so that they trust you, that you're not trying to mislead them. And then finally, the use of text. You'll see that for all the stories we tell in this session, because the data is static, because the data is understood and the patterns have already been identified, the use of text enhances the clarity, it enhances the story, and it gives people a quick summary that they can take-home message that they will remember without them having to actually know the exact numbers. It also tells them how to sort of interpret what it is that you're showing them. So that's a fairly basic data story. Not a lot going on there. One data point, it was interesting. I wanted to explore it a bit deeper, supplemented it with a couple of data sets from publicly available data sets, and we built a story. Right, we're now going to go and look at something a little bit more advanced, a little bit with a couple more techniques and things that we're interested in. So we'll go back here and back there, and we'll go to story number 2. Now, this story also came from our exploratory report, and it's started with these 2 graphs. So these 2 graphs come straight from the exploratory report. I've just added in some titles onto my graphs that show what they show rather than, or tell what the graph shows, rather than being an explicit number of names over time. It actually says the number of names has increased over time because I know what the pattern looks like. And the second one says fewer and fewer people have one of the 10 most popular names. So this is again what I was talking about with that visual header tooltip. Basically, I've said what percentage of all males born in a year have one of the 10 most popular male names, and what percentage of all females born in a year have one of the 10 most popular female names. That's this measure here, and then I'm comparing them over time. So the reason I was interested in this was because my mom is quite old-fashioned, and in the way that old-fashioned and conservative people do, she frequently complains about people's names. What kind of a name is this? And of course, you know, it's something that we just have to bear. But I was interested to see how names are actually changing over time and whether this was a true thing or whether it was a perception. So firstly, spoiler alert, it's not a perception. There are more and more different names coming into being all the time. And the number of people who are given the most popular names is decreasing over time. So that's immediately we have something there. But there are some interesting other things that I found whilst I was exploring this data. So the first thing was that I wanted to see whether there were certain states in the US, and this came from my thinking of maybe certain more conservative states, or where this trend wasn't prevalent, versus maybe more liberal or states, and if it was a difference. And I didn't know what I was looking for data here. I didn't know what I was going to find. So the first thing I tried to do was I tried to put this data into a map, because geographical data we generally should represent on a map. It makes the most sense. It's sort of a best practice. But it turns out that this is not a very easy visual, and I didn't like it. So even though the geographical representation of geographical data is a generally accepted way to go, I decided that I thought it worked better by if I put it in a table. So this is our data story then. Right, so let's pop into PowerPoint, have a look at what the design choices we've made here are, and how we've tried to include that story, improve that story, should I say. So if we go into our second story, now we're looking at improvements. We're not looking at the real basics anymore. We're looking at a couple of little improvements and things we could do. The first one, using titles. I did talk about this, using titles to emphasize the story. It can be the title of the whole report, it can be the title of each individual visual. It helps the user to understand exactly what it is that they're looking at, makes it very easy for them to see what you want them to see. The second one, I took this as inspiration from Pirates of the Caribbean. The code is more like guidelines rather than actual rules. And in this case, what I'm talking about is, in fact, our visuals. As I was talking about, using maps is the best practice for geographical data, but that is a guideline. That is not a rule. In this case, I thought it worked better to use it in a table, and I chose to do that. So that's another point that you can keep in mind. Thirdly, positioning. I didn't actually show this. We can maybe pop back into that Power BI report just so I can tell you what I was talking about. So in this visual here, this table, you can see that I've put the male and female data bars next to each other, and I've had them diverging from a similar x-axis. So this one starts on the right-hand side of the bar, this one starts on the left-hand side of the bar. So what that allows you to do is it allows your eye to very quickly look at the thickness of the two and make an assumption as to what they're trying to show. You can see as I were in this graph that it's much easier that way than if I'd put it on the other side of female and put a number in between and left aligned them both. It would be much more difficult to judge the relative size of the bars. So this was a positioning decision, and it helps make it easier for the viewer. Okay, and then our last point at this point is what I call better text. And in this case, I added some additional highlighting points. I highlighted which graph or what data the part of the story was talking about, which graph, etc. Just again, all we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that our user gets the best experience from the report that they could possibly have. Okay, so we're going to move on now to a series of data stories. Each one of them only really has one key point that I want to talk about. So we'll go back here, go to story number 3. Got to remember to actually go there. Story number 3. So this one, basically what I wanted to do was, this came from knowing that a lot of names start with similar letters. So, for instance, the two most popular male names, James and John, both start with J's. And I wanted to know how names differed from the general distribution of words in the English language. Now, in this case, this is now not a very easy thing to visualize because I have to show you a couple of different points. I have to show you where each letter ranks in the English language in terms of what percentage of words are made up by start with that letter, should I say. And then I have to show you where the names rank. And there's two different ways that we can think about the names, because you can think about how many babies were born with a given first letter. So in that case, James counts as 5 million out of our total of 300 million, and John counts as 4.8, whatever. Or you can think of how many different names there are. So James counts as 1 and John counts as 1. So this is quite a difficult thing to visualize. There's a lot going on. But at least we know that when we want to compare two measures against each other, the best visual to use in that case is in fact a scatter graph, scatter plot like this. And because we're comparing percentages against percentages, in this case, it's very nice because we can put in a symmetry line which shows which values are overperforming their expected and which are underperforming. So that's a start. Let's have a look at some of the things that happen. Okay, so a couple of things here. I've tried to highlight those differences by using color as well as the symmetry line. And then I've just basically put in my story. And part of this story here is in fact about having to go and do some research about why something happens, because it's so valuable to be able to actually tell your user why we are noticing something that is potentially unexplained or different or variant. So in this case, as I sort of expected, J is severely overrepresented. In fact, almost 14% of babies born have J as the first letter of their name, and almost 8% of unique names start with J. As opposed to less than 1% of words in English that start with the letter J. So there's a huge overrepresentation over there. And then on the other side, we have these two, U and P, which are severely underrepresented. And you can look there again. Almost 10% of words in English start with the letter P, but less than 3% of babies' names start with the letter P, and less than 2% of unique names start with the letter P. And similarly for U, 6% of words and less than 0.25% of babies. So we have these really big disparities here. And I thought it would be really interesting to try and find out why. And so basically, that's the story. You can read it yourself. But really, the interesting thing here is that the overrepresentations, J and Y particularly, are due to the prevalence of biblical names. And that's the Hebrew language and the Christian faith. And how the letter J, which is very, very important letter in the language and also in the faith. So that was quite an interesting thing for me to find out. And then the other one, of course, in terms of the underrepresentation, U and P, I can't find any proof of this, but I think that from a little bit of research that I did and some things I sort of read up, is that U and P are the two most popular letters for prefixes to start with. If you think of un and pro and those kinds of prefixes, and that kind of because of these prefixes, you get a skew of the number of words, because words that start with all kinds of letters share a prefix, and therefore you get this massive distribution skew because of that. And that's that's the data that I could find, and that's the best example I could find of why these two letters would be so prevalent. And so that's really the point of this little story, is to think about going and actually finding out why things happen, and how much more interesting it is if you can go, hey, I know why there's so many people whose names start with J. I know why there's so many people, or so few, relatively speaking, people whose names start with the letter P, type of thing. So if we pop back into PowerPoint, we're just going to go through this kind of as we do them. So the only real thing that I wanted to talk about here in terms of additional design tools in our story is in fact the tooltip. And you saw how I used that when I wanted to get additional information about my scatter plot. It would be impossible to try and put all of that data about how much percent of this and that and all of these variables on one visual, unless you put it in a table, and then it would be very difficult to really see what was going on. So we show the relationship, we show the important part in the visual, and then we give the additional context by using that visual tooltip that I showed. So that's really how we tell a good story, or enhance our story and make it easier for people to understand. Then if we go back, we can have a look at another story. Actually be in Power BI. If we look at this one, this is a story that I was playing around with the play axis, and I saw some interesting stuff, and I thought this would be something that's fairly interesting to talk about. And this is basically about what I've called sex neutral names, or names that have changed over time from being either strongly malely associated with males to strongly associated with females, or vice versa, or perhaps they've gone back and forth. Whatever it is, what I've done here is I created a set of parameters or rules to work out what names qualified here, and to make my data set more manageable. So the first thing is, I said that this has to be a fairly common name, so there have to be at least 50,000 babies born with this name over the data set that I have. So it's narrowed it down to a subset of the data. And then I've said that in one of the years, or in at least 1 year, 65% of babies had to have been born, must have been male, and at least 65% must have been female in another year that were given this name. So basically that says that at least at one point in time, this was much more strongly associated with males, and at another point in time, it was much more strongly associated with females. So what we've done there is we've basically defined a set of parameters, but because it's a fairly complicated thing, I've actually put those rules as a part of the report, and they can always be seen. If anyone ever needs to know, you don't have to go into the filters and try and work out what the filters are and what they mean, and then see that there are measures and then dig into the measures. Nope, the rules are defined and they're clearly marked on the actual data set. And then what I've done is, because if you think about this, what I really want to show is I want to show all of these different names, and I want to show them over time. That would almost be impossible to do without this play axis. And we did touch on it earlier, how this is growing in popularity. But I really like this on scatter plots. I really like play axes for showing how things move over time. So I'm just going to play this briefly, and then we'll talk about one or two of the things that we see. So here we go. You'll just see you can sort of follow any name you want and see how it changes over time. I'm just waiting for one or two that I know are coming, and then I will sort of show them. There's one. Here it comes. So we're only entering the 1930s now, the mid 1930s. So we haven't seen much change yet. But here's an interesting name, Leslie, which is now going to move. You'll see it'll move down to the female side and never really change, never really come back. Specifically, that spelling of Leslie will stay as a highly female name. We're going to carry on a little bit here. We've also got this name Kerry and also Kelly. So we've got these names that are both very strongly associated with males at this point in time, and now they're going to move and become very strongly associated with females. Right, so let's just hop back into PowerPoint quickly and talk about this. So when we have data sets, particularly when our data sets are reflective of a long time, or they have axes that change drastically, moving data is a good solution to that problem, and it is increasing in popularity as we go. Also, just at this point, talking about color as a pre-attentive attribute. We've in fact done it a couple of times, talking about using saturation and the dark and light shades of the same color to indicate how far along a certain scalar is. We've sort of seen that on the last two reports. Right. So now we're going to go on to my favorite data story, and we don't have much time, so we're going to go through it quite quickly. But I love Friends. I absolutely love Friends show. I can often be found quoting it or posting Friends GIFs on chats and things. But one of the things I was interested in is, it was such a huge cultural phenomenon. Did it affect the names of people born in the periods sort of during and just after the show, when it was at the height of its popularity? And even now going on after the show, as the viewers and those who sort of grew up with the show have had families, etc. So the first thing we can quickly look at, and you can see that with Phoebe, the name Phoebe has definitely exploded over time. I don't think it has much to do with Friends, although it does look as though it really started taking off as Friends, while Friends is on, and it seems to have gone up and kept going up since Friends went off the air. Joey is a bit of a difficult one, because Joey, Joseph, Joe, lots of variations of the name. So I don't think there's too much to be gleaned there. Chandler, another sort of unusual name. Definitely can see a big influence while the show was on. In fact, more babies were born and given the name Chandler than Phoebe, which I thought was quite interesting. I would have thought that Phoebe was a much more common name, but if you look at the absolute values, you're looking at a range of 0 to 1,000 versus a range of 0 to sort of 2,500. So very interesting there to see that. And then Monica, I am doing this in this order for a reason. Monica, interestingly, seems to have been, it was going up just at the time that Friends started, and then suddenly has fallen and has never stopped falling since then. Now, that could be partially to do with Friends, but there was another very famous Monica in the mid-1990s, and that may also have had something to do with it. So I don't really have much information about what made this happen, but it is quite interesting. But what I really want to talk about is Ross and Rachel. Everybody's favorite, love to hate them couple, Ross and Rachel. So Most people hated Ross, aren't big fans of Ross. So if we look at the name Ross, it was sort of popular before Friends started, and maybe that's why they chose it as a name for a character in the show. Season one, Ross, it sort of went down. Season two, when maybe sort of the height of Ross's popularity, him and Rachel were together. Season two and season three, name got a big boost. Towards the end of season three, they broke up, and his name has been in freefall ever since. So breaking up with Rachel, really bad idea for the world population of Rosses. So what we would expect then is that Rachel probably has gone in the opposite direction, right? So we look at Rachel. Again, it was a popular name before the show started. Seasons 1, 2, and 3, height of popularity. Rachel and Ross broke up. It fell off a cliff. So it's really interesting. It seems like the most significant event in the names of Ross and Rachel were, in fact, the TV breakup of characters of the same name, and neither of those names has recovered from that event. Just something fun, something that I have an emotional connection to, and that actually is the last point of our sort of data storytelling workshop, is if you can create an emotional connection with your audience, that is the most likely you are to be able to give them a message to take home and to do something with. People will remember your stories if they had an emotional connection. People will action their stories if they care. And that really is the end of what I'd like to say today, is try and tell stories that make people care, because that is the best way for you to make a difference with your data storytelling. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. And hit me up on Twitter, on LinkedIn. You can find me at either of those places. I do respond to people. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much. Goodbye.